Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project designed to let me spend more time than I'd ever get on the radio with interesting people. Although, in the case of Baroness Lola Young, I'm fairly confident that an hour will not be enough.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm a bit of a talker, James, so let's go for it and see what happens.
Well, I don't know where to begin because your new book, 8 Weeks, addresses the first part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, of course, it's the subsequent parts of your life with which some people listening will be familiar, some people will not. And then the bits in between, if you like, are equally interesting. So let's begin with the beginning. Why is the book called 8 Weeks?
It's called 8 Weeks because that's the age at which I was handed over by my, I think, mother and father together to a foster mother, an elderly white woman in Tufnell Park Road, North London. And so, yes, that was my start in foster care.
And yet you believed for many years that you were 6 weeks old.
Yeah, I did. And actually, that might seem like a trivial thing, but I don't know about you, but when I learned from reading the records that it was 8 weeks, what it meant to me was that was another 2 weeks that I'd spent with my mother, and that she'd still decided that she couldn't cope for whatever reason with looking after me. So although it's a relatively trivial thing, it did feel like a big moment.
It was an unconventional fostering, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you say unconventional, but in those days, when we're talking about the 50s and 60s, I don't even know if there were that many conventions, to be honest with you.
If you weren't in a children's home, then
yeah,
you would be in the sort of situation that you found yourself in.
Yeah, but there was lots of informal fostering
yes,
that went on. And we were a mixed bunch. So there was me, there were two others, kind of early to late teens, and they were more conventionally fostered in as much as their parents couldn't look after them, and the council paid Daisy, my foster mother. And then there was another child whom I talk about quite a bit, Kyan, and she was 4 years younger than me, but her parents paid her upkeep and everything, so that was entirely different.
But no one paid anything for you?
Well, my mother tried every now and then, and it's funny because when I look at the records and you've got the amount of money that's involved, and you think, well, that's nothing, but actually it's quite a lot. So my mother tried to pay every now and then £2 a week.
I mean, as an adopted person, the what's the word I'm looking for? The weight that a shoebox full of papers can carry, or just a sheath of papers can carry is something that I think I understand. But already you're describing a childhood so out of the ordinary that it assumes even more importance, doesn't it, to try to get some answers to some questions that you grew up not knowing the answers to. Sorry, no. How conscious were you from a very early age of just how different your situation was?
Well, I think I was conscious quite early on at school.
Yeah.
So, for example, when this elderly white lady comes up to school for a parents' evening when I was in primary school, everybody knows, myself included, that she's not my biological mother. So there was that. But then again, I sort of assumed that some of the other elements of life would be the same. So to me, I thought, well, maybe everybody has a health visitor come around and check that their sleeping accommodation is all right and all the rest of it. So it was totally unlike other people. And the more I got to see other people's homes, and particularly their parents. So you talk about being adopted. That was my fantasy.
Right.
I thought, if only I could be adopted, that would be amazing.
And Daisy was 64, as you mentioned, when she took you in. So
yeah.
Why? And I know you've had a crack at answering this, but why do you think she did?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, as I say, my mother wasn't really contributing very much. My father hardly anything. And so you sort of think, why would this elderly white woman who was a war widow? And there is a temptation to kind of do this rationalisation. She was obviously, in many respects, a very kind-hearted, generous person. But when I looked back at some of the elements of her life, many of which I didn't want to go into in the book because it felt like that's her story and her family's story. But it felt like she'd encountered a lot of tragedy in her own personal life. And maybe that made her feel compassionate towards people, because she did fight for me to stay with her. And I didn't know that when I was a kid. That's something I found out in the records.
Let's talk briefly then about the records, about it was in 2012, I think, that you got access to
I'm not very good with dates, but I think, I finally got access in 2012.
March 2012. How come it took so long, and why were you so keen to find out more?
Well, firstly, it took a long time because I didn't even know that you could have access to your records. It didn't even occur to me that there were such things.
There'd be a file somewhere.
Exactly. And what would that even... I couldn't even conceive of that. And it was only because a friend I had was a probation officer, and she said, 1989, this act was passed, which I think, don't hold me to it, but I think helped to make a bit more parity between children in the care system and adopted children, because I think there's always been that sort of, for a long time, there's been that possibility with adopted children finding out who they were. But for kids in the care system, not until 1989. And as I say, I only found this out in 20, whenever it was, through Sal. And I thought, well, there are some questions that I've had that I've sort of suppressed over the years. Like, how come my mother and father were together like this? I've had different stories and different ideas put
No one
forward.
you could ask, really?
No one I could really ask, no, because everybody had died, to be quite honest with you. And so it's like, where would I even find this out? So this idea of the records, I thought maybe I could get some of those answers from there.
And it was about... Would identity be too strong a word? Or is a relationship between curiosity and identity, isn't there?
Yeah, this thing about identity, it's so... What's the phrase? It does a lot of heavy lifting, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So, and people are very kind of sort of linear when they think about identity. You're either this or you're that. And if you're that, you can't be this as well. So my identity, insofar as it was there, I related very strongly to being a Londoner, because that was the one point of stability, and to being black, of course. Maybe not so much female when I was younger, although there were certain things I wanted to do I couldn't do. But this thing about being in care was a big part of my identity, and still is. So it wasn't so much a search for identity in that sense, because I think I had cut myself off from this idea that I had family and parents in any kind of, any way that kind of touched convention.
As a self-protection.
Yeah, I think, certainly initially that's how it started, absolutely. Because, they don't want me, so I don't want them, and I don't need them. Yeah.
Lem Sissay has written about his experiences in care and foster families, but he also writes on the flyleaf of your new book about you taking your 8-year-old by the hand and leading her through these mysteries. I don't imagine you saw it quite like that.
No, but Lem, he's like, his way with words is just extraordinary. And I was so gratified when he agreed to write something, because we go back quite a bit, as you might imagine. We bumped into each other and we had this thing about care records. And I think part of what it is, James, is like you can extrapolate from all of these different experiences and say, well, this happens, you feel abandonment, you feel loss, you searching for identity, and so on and so forth. But every story is also very different. So even with Lem and I, there are lots of things that we kind of crossed over with, but then we also recognise what the differences are. And his experience was, really kind of heartrending. So, this idea that that you're searching for something, always searching for something. I didn't want to be in that position, but by the same token, I wanted to know as much as possible.
So the amateur psychologist now, me.
In the psychiatrist chair.
Something like that, is thinking, because you became a social worker after leaving care, you went back to one of the homes that you'd been in. And I, because the experience of therapy for me was very much, as Lem describes it, as contacting your younger self, and you were looking after other children, whereas perhaps subconsciously, I know that you were looked after until you were 14 by Daisy, but whether subconsciously you were reaching out to little Lola, as it were, and seeking to look after her a bit more.
Well, see, this is the beauty of an interview like this, because honestly, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. So that to me adds another really interesting layer.
It's only a thought that came to me while I was reading it.
Yeah, well, it didn't come to me when I was writing it. So thank you, James. And now I don't need to spend loads of money on a therapist.
Oh, I don't know about that. We all need therapy.
Oh my gosh,
under my glorious rule, that would be top of the list. So let's back up a little bit. Your parents were both Nigerian. Mm-hmm. Your dad had a family in Lagos, mm-hmm. which perhaps explains why they weren't setting up a domestic idyll in Tufnell Park. But how much of that did you know? And what were your earliest memories? Because you were, albeit that I understand completely the difference between 6 weeks and 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Objectively, you were a tiny baby, so you won't have memories of that period.
No, exactly.
When did this knowledge start presenting itself to you?
It's kind of been incremental over the years. So so Daisy always said to me, I took you in when you were 6 weeks old. That's where the idea of 6 weeks came from. And she would say to me, your father is a doctor and your mother is a nurse. And again, records said slightly different story to that. And then, so that was the knowledge that I had, and that my parents had divorced.
And you never didn't have that knowledge because she would be saying this stuff.
That was fundamental.
Yeah,
that's kind of like the founding narrative,
yes.
if you like. So it wasn't until I got older, much older, and let me think. So Kyan's parents maybe had a little bit of knowledge about me because they were very distantly related. But then I remember in one of the homes I was in out in the countryside, one of the people who worked there, who was also Nigerian, which was quite unusual in this is mid-60s, she said she would find out about my family. Now, I don't know, at the time, I never found out from her what it was she found out. And again, it was when I came to the records that I found this other information. So I got these little drip feeds of information. There was this amazing coincidence that when I sang in a band, and one of the other women that we were the three, I was going to say the 3 degrees, not quite, but we were singing.
Someone already got there.
Yeah, somebody else. No, not they hadn't by then. But we were singing, and it turned out that she was related to somebody who was related to and knew my mother. Gosh. So she fixed up for me to meet with. I can't remember all the pseudonyms I gave people. I think it was Chief Mrs. Arden. Okay. She fixed up for me to meet with her, and that was in my 20s. And then a series of meetings, again, the drip feeding of bits of information. And so gradually I got these parts of a jigsaw, I think is how I understood it. Yeah.
Clearly. Is it complete now?
No.
And
it will never be complete.
It will never be complete.
It can never be, and it could never be complete because... partly because both my father and mother are dead.
Yes.
So anything that I wanted to sort of say to them, why did you do this? Or how did this come about? There was never that opportunity. And, I describe in the book how some of those meetings were so torturous.
Yes, particularly with your mother.
Yeah, well, I hadn't seen her. She went back to Nigeria when I was 7 or 8. And then I saw her when I was 28. So quite a lot to say besides, you've grown.
Everything and nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so strange. It was like being in somebody else's movie.
I don't get whether it's a background hum of curiosity, like you're conscious of not knowing. You know, quite often on Full Disclosure, we realise that everybody thinks their childhood is normal because it's the only childhood they have, but that actually doesn't apply to you. You knew your childhood was, I don't want to say abnormal, but you knew it was extraordinary.
Yes.
You knew that this was not an experience that any of your peers at school would have shared particularly. But were you hungry for knowledge, or were you just quietly concerned, quietly curious?
I think maybe there were spurts of hunger.
Yes.
And so when Chief Mrs. Arden gave me some scraps, actually I say scraps, it was the most complete account I had before I got to the records.
Right.
So she told me this story, and I won't go into all the detail because it takes forever. It's so complicated. I feel like I need cards to explain it to people. But so she gave me quite a substantial story, which I found quite shocking. It was quite shocking to me at the time. So I'm talking about mid-20s.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, well, what can I do with this knowledge? And at that point, both my parents were still alive. They were both in Nigeria, had their own lives. But I'm thinking, what am I meant to do with this knowledge? Because in some respects, it just reinforced that sense that I wasn't wanted. And they each had their own families, either prior to my existence or subsequent to. And so, you know, who was I? Where did I didn't fit in. That wasn't my family, or that wasn't a conventional family by any means.
How wanted did Daisy make you feel?
Yeah, that's another good question. And I would say she did her best. And that sounds a little bit inadequate in many respects, because on the one hand, you have to say, here was this woman on a widow's pension. She took me in when very few white foster mothers would take black kids. And there were quite a few people coming over from Nigeria, West Africa, and what have you. And she took me in, and she was prepared to keep looking after me, even though there was only sort of, you know, infrequent payments made for me. So that was great. And on that level, I kind of felt a sense of security. But by the same token, I was quite aware that this wasn't enormously popular throughout the house. So maybe I should explain that we lived in the basement of this house, and then there were layers of her family going all the way up the house to her daughter, her granddaughter, and her great-grandchildren. And so...
And their husbands, obviously.
And the husbands of each of those people. And... but then I don't want to... It's so complicated. And so what I say to people is it's not either nice or nasty. No. It's not either this or that. It's like a very complex intermixture of all of these different things. So, for example, Daisy's daughter, I subsequently found out, wasn't particularly enamoured of the way the arrangements were set up regarding me, because there wasn't this payment coming in. But by the same token, Christmas was fantastic. We all went up to her flat. She'd give us great presents. We'd have masses of food. And that was probably...
that's a happy memory.
Yeah, it's a very happy memory. In fact, it's almost Dickensian in its tradition, but also including Knees Up Mother Brown and things like that. So... Yeah.
What were you sort of, because you mentioned that you were in a band. For people who don't know, you became an actress before becoming a sort of cultural professional, and subsequently you sit in the House of Lords. So what enthusiasms did you discover when you were living with Daisy? What would you perform for her?
Arts? No, wouldn't perform for her. But Kyan and I always sang along.
Did you?
To South Pacific.
You're still close to Kyan.
Sorry?
You're still close to Kyan.
Yeah. We've had our moments as everybody does, but we've always kept in touch. And so we can both recite huge chunks of Tony Hancock's Half Hour, which we listened to avidly, which in itself, sort of looking back at it again, you know, you talk about culture, black culture, white culture, whatever. There were we, the children of temporary Nigerian migrants who were very middle class and well educated, and there were we loving Tony Hancock on a Sunday afternoon.
Why wouldn't you?
And why wouldn't we?
Yes.
Because that's what we were brought up with. So we love music. Kyan was a professional in terms of teaching music to school kids, which was great. So she really pursued that in a much more professional way than me in many respects. But I just sort of sang in a band because I was asked to, and I just thought, wow, I didn't even know I could sing. So that was good fun.
We're jumping all over the place, but I think that fits your story really, because everything informs everything with you. And it occurs to me as you were talking there about the absence of a sort of homogenous black or white culture, that informs your attitude to the placing of children in care now, doesn't it? The idea that we won't put a black child with that mixed race family because they're so middle class, you've written about.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the complexity of the situation. And the problem is, as I think I say towards the end, systems aren't necessarily built to help people. They're built to justify being systems. So whatever makes the systems work is not necessarily what is best for the people who are trapped in those systems, particularly those who are kind of in there in an involuntary way. So that whole thing about transracial adoptions, transracial fostering, I'm not saying nobody's going to draw me into saying, yes, it's a good thing, or no, it's a bad thing 100% of the time. It's context dependent. It depends on the children. It depends on the families. And quite frankly, this idea that there's one sort of black monoculture and anything that's outside of that isn't suitable for a kid in care is just ridiculous.
Because what they need is love.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the word that systems can't cope.
But it's also a word that you're not entirely comfortable with when you're asked whether Daisy loved you or whether she ever told you that she loved you. I think Rachel Cook asked you about this in the Observer interview, which is a brilliant question.
It is a brilliant question, and I can't remember exactly what I said.
I think you said no one had ever asked you that before.
Yeah, nobody had ever asked me that before. And actually, I'd never thought about it in those terms before. So I resorted to academic self, which is what comprises love. You sound
like Prince Charles now.
Oh, no, don't do this to me. Well, I mentioned about his A-levels and my A-levels, and we're a similar kind of age. But yes, slightly different family upbringing.
But the notion of love.
Exactly. No, seriously, because... and again, thinking about the 50s and the 60s, people didn't spell it out.
No.
That the potency of all you need is love, which came along in the love and peace in the 60s, was that there hadn't been anything around that kind of discourse preceding it. So when people started talking about love and peace and all the rest of it, what's all of that about? So yeah.
So love can be a meal.
It can certainly be having 3 meals a day and not having, because I never worried about not having anything to eat, or clothing was a little bit different because I was into, to go back to your original question, I was always into creative stuff, right? So I remember having a little toy sewing machine when I was little. I made clothes for the dolls. And then, when I was older, I would design fashion, clothing, and I would want to write. I made little books of stories. And I always loved reading. So, the arts and culture, although I wasn't encouraged, as hardly anybody was again in those days. People.
So you're finding it for yourself, really?
Yeah, I was finding it for myself, but with others at school.
So we're at Tufnell Park Primary School.
We are at Tufnell Park Primary School, but it was kind of embellished, perhaps I might say, in Parliament Hill School when I went to secondary school. Yeah.
You elected not to go to grammar school. You passed the 11 plus, but
that's
you
right.
didn't think that was for you.
Yeah, and now I look back at that self and I think, Lola, how did you come to that conclusion? I think it's because I read stuff, and we must have had discussions about it, and I had this impression about the way in which people were divided up. It's almost like the sheep and the goats, right? So, yes, you've passed your 11 plus and therefore you will go to a grammar school. And Parliament Hill was a very good comprehensive school. So to me, it seemed like you'd get... I mean, part of this is post hoc rationalisation, but I do remember it was a definite decision that I made in spite of the fact that my then best friend was going to the grammar school. I didn't want to go there.
And was there anyone you could have this conversation with except yourself?
Not really.
Right.
No, I think it was maybe, I can't think, maybe, I mean, it's not beyond belief that I might have read an article or two about comprehensive schools.
Yeah, a political point.
Yeah, exactly. But I was definitely aware of a certain kind of class divide. And maybe I felt that I'd feel more, well, I definitely felt that I'd be more at home amongst the wider group of people, all girls as it happened.
Okay, yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
As opposed, I mean, I think you've used the word snobby, but it covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it, actually?
Yeah,
although, I suppose, biologically, your background was quite posh.
Well, this is one of the many contradictions, which now I can look back and think it's interesting rather than infuriating or depressing. It's this idea that, because sometimes I've said to people, I went through the care system. I've never tried to hide that. And there's been an assumption, A, that I was from the Caribbean, and B, that I was from, when I sort of correct them on that I was from some sort of deprived family situation. And whatever, obviously they were students at the time when they were both here. So I don't know exactly what their financial situation was. But the fact was they came here to study.
Which already puts them in a slightly rarefied
exactly.
category.
And particularly, medicine. Well, that's a long haul.
Sure.
Which was my father's original intention, apparently. Then he switched to law and was called to the bar, which is, again, another long haul. And you've got to be self-sufficient financially. So, yes.
Before we get to Parliament Hill, I think at home and at Tufnell Park Primary School, you had your first experiences of being viewed through a racialised lens, which again you'd have no one you could talk to about. No one could guide you or help you with that.
No, it was weird because some part of me recognised that there might be some kind of what we'd call now cultural capital in being this exotic figure, okay? So I was one of 2 or 3 black kids at my primary school. And I distinctly remember, because I have quite a strange memory, I distinctly remember a child saying to me on the way to Tufnell Park Primary School, "Oh, it's a really hot day, isn't it?" And I remember saying, "Yeah, but it's not as hot as it is in Africa." It's like, I didn't know anything about Africa. It's like, I couldn't even put a pin on it in a map, So, but I thought there must have been some part of me that thought, well, I could use this to my advantage. And the awe, the look of awe that followed that. I thought, yeah, maybe. But that was obviously very different to the blatant racism and some of the kind of covert racism and the ignorance.
Which you got at home and at school. I think Daisy's son-in-law was one of your first introductions to...
Yeah, and it's tough, really, because, he wasn't a nasty person. He wasn't a malevolent person that wanted to make me feel uncomfortable. But I was sitting there listening to this, and as I recall, I was either drawing or writing or studiously reading, trying to pretend I wasn't a part of this, because I found it embarrassing, this idea that I would be seen in this way or thought of in this way. And, it was quite tough to take. But then again, it was of a different order to being spat at in the street.
Which
or
also
called
happened
names.
a little later.
All of those things.
And there was a particularly strange trip to Devon as well, wasn't there?
Yeah. Well, it was good. It was nice because, again, my best friend that I, didn't go to school with in secondary school, her parents paid for me to go. So that was very kind of them. It was a school journey. We went for a week to Devon. And honestly, I think that was when I sussed that that whole exotic thing was not going to be for me, because it was like, I don't know if I mention it in the book, but there was this guy who kept drawing me. So every time I went past a particular point, he had his paper and charcoal, and it was a tourist thing, But every time I went past, he said, "Oh, let me draw you, let me draw you." And it became like this unwanted attention. So I was caught between wanting to be invisible and wanting to be visible as a loved child. Well, that wasn't on the table, but being invisible also wasn't on the table. So, it was quite difficult.
And then you get, as you say, to Parliament Hill Comprehensive School, and it's on the walk home sometimes, I think, that you encountered the nastiest sort of abuse.
Yeah, and again, well, you know what memory's like, James.
It's very unreliable.
It's unreliable. It has to be selective, otherwise you'd be completely insane. But interestingly, this only came back to me after meeting somebody who'd seen that I was in the House of Lords, who had been a friend at school. I invited her over, we had a cup of tea, and she said, I remember you telling me about the boys from Ackland Burley School who would line up and call you names. You came into school quite distressed on a number of occasions. And I thought, yeah. And I struggled for quite obvious reasons, I guess. I didn't want to have that in my memory banks, as it were. So, but it was interesting that she in particular remembered that.
It's a toughening up process is almost too inadequate a term, isn't it, to describe the need to or assume almost a survival personality, which would explain why you've forgotten.
Yeah, no, I think the survival thing is quite strong. It is, because it's like, I've got to look after myself, because I can't rely on other people, particularly after Daisy died when I was 14 and I went through this quite rough period.
We'll come to that, because I was about to ask you how conscious you were of the infirmity of your foundation. So even though you were safe at Daisy's, the circumstances were not common, and she was an old lady. So can you remember being conscious of the fragility of those foundations?
A little bit, yes, because one of the other kids who was there at the time, quite a bit older than me, he would often be shipped off to a home that was, as I understood it, was for naughty boys.
Right.
So, and I thought, well, if I do something really badly wrong that displeases Daisy, will I be shipped off to a home for naughty girls? So there was always that kind of thing in the background. It wasn't to the foreground. I'd be lying if I said I thought about it all the time.
Of course.
But I was aware of some fragility in that situation.
Which came to pass when you were 14, and
yes.
I think you found Daisy in pain, didn't you, yourself?
Yes, I did. Yeah, that was pretty grim. I mean, she fell out of bed one morning, and it was before I was getting up for school, and I can see this huge lump like a ping pong ball on her head where she'd hit her head. Anyway, long story short, she had to go into hospital. She hadn't long been released from hospital for pleurisy, I think it was. Okay. She went back into hospital, and that was obviously again well, it was horrible for her, of course, and her immediate family.
Would you call her family?
Not instinctively.
You wouldn't?
No, although I always called her mum.
Yeah.
So, but then Kyan always called her mum, and she was perfectly well aware that she had her own mother and father because she would see them.
She had much more contact with hers than you did. So, and indeed, you went to live with them for a while after Daisy died.
Yes, that's right.
Which was suboptimal.
Well, at first, it didn't look like it was going to be suboptimal. It became, there was just a clash. I mean, you could describe it, if you were so minded, as a cultural clash. And it was certainly difficult for Kyan as well. And the two of us formed a little gang of two and tried to survive this moment. And we had our own ways of doing that, and as kids do. But I think eventually I tried the patience of Mr. and Mrs. Taylor to such an extent that they weren't prepared to keep me any longer. And at the time I thought, you know what, I'm happy to go.
And this is July 1966, when you go to Park House, a children's home in Hertfordshire that was about an hour from your school.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is potentially very traumatizing stuff, but I think we've established you'd already built a form of survival personality. So I don't want to say you take it in your stride, but you don't let yourself get bogged down in the trauma.
I'm making faces, I know, because that's what I always do as thoughts are going through my head. So I'm thinking carapace, that thing I've built this shell around myself. Yeah. That allows things to kind of bounce off or not sort of get through to me, to my core. And then I'm thinking, but at the same time, I was heading for that depression which emerged later.
Because you can only keep it at bay for so long.
Yeah, exactly, especially with no one really to have that conversation with. So I would talk about bits with school friends, but they were living in such different circumstances.
And however much they cared for you, they can't.
Yeah, exactly. And, it was just... so it was trying to protect myself, really.
So before we get further into that period of your life, there was an offer to go back to Lagos. I mean, I think two offers.
Yeah.
But you weren't begged or importuned.
No, it didn't feel like, well, I'm saying again, the post hoc rationalisation.
Of course, yeah.
So, you're 7 years old and this woman who's your mother, and she's your mother, but you've probably seen her twice a year up until the age of 7, then says, oh, come back to Lagos with me. And I'm like, Lagos, here's my mum, Daisy's my mum, and here are my friends, and no thank you very much. And then my father was a bit older, but still only 12, when he also said he was going back. Now, here's the thing. It's a contested part of the story, which isn't in the book, and we won't go into the detail about that if you don't mind. But the argument is that, well, you, Lola, said no, you didn't want to go. And also your mother was saying that she didn't want you, Lola, to go with your father. Now, I only found out the latter again when I got the care records, and I don't know why. There's nothing to say why that was the case. But again, looking back on it, it seems like if you really were serious about that, you'd say, well, I don't care what your mother says or what you say, you're coming back with me. However, even the people who contest my side of the story would admit that it would have been tremendously difficult for me had I gone to Lagos. I mean, the lifestyle and everything would have been totally, well,
alien.
It would have been just so different from what I'd experienced. And I don't know if I would have adjusted very well to that.
So when you get to Park House, another side effect of that is the only address that your mother and father, biological parents, had for you in London would have been Daisy's house. So you're no longer there.
Yes,
so that is a kind of cutting of any form of umbilical.
Yes, yeah. Again, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. So I guess you could say that maybe they did right to Daisy, or because later on there's a letter from social services to my mother saying Daisy has died and Lola is now living with the Taylors. And my mother writes back a cool couple of sentences. But maybe, I don't know. Who knows? And again, James, it's this thing of the records. This is why the records couldn't tell me everything.
Yes, of course.
And it was a bit of a fantasy in my head that I was going to resolve some of these big issues.
It's often the way when people try and, particularly for adopted children as well, who think that when they track down their biological family, it will somehow solve things. It won't solve anything. It will never solve anything. All it can do is shed a little bit of light into previously dark corners. But
maybe,
and not everyone's always grateful for that,
Well, exactly, and that's you could do another 10 podcasts on the outcomes of tracing some of these things back. And there was this fear for me that there would be something so awful in the records that I'd never be the same again.
Yes.
But it didn't quite pan out that way.
There is a fairly awful thing happens 3 months after you get to the children's home. When you mentioned that your dream was being adopted, there was a couple in Barnet who were interested in fostering another child, and you thought that perhaps you were going to get a family of sorts. And then that got dashed away as well.
Yeah. I think there were others in between as well. But that was the most that, I actually stayed with them for a weekend or two. And then I found out in what I felt was quite a brutal way that wasn't going to happen. So
because she got pregnant herself.
Yes, that's right. But my understanding, well, anyway, whatever my understanding was, it's hard to tell whether it was this because I had this fantastic imagination, so I could imagine myself in all these situations. Looking back, I think I would say to the 15-year-old Lola, you're 15. Nobody's going to adopt a gangly black girl of 15. So cut with the fantasies. But there was this idea that because I was so longing to be closer to school, which would have meant I could have seen my school friends and socialised with them a bit more, which I couldn't do in Hertfordshire. So it was kind of a disappointment. But then again, there is this thing of what I think my reaction was at the time.
Yes.
Compared to some of the things that come up in the records. So.
It's like a duality almost.
Yes, yeah.
And the stuff that doesn't necessarily turn out to be true doesn't carry less resonance.
Exactly. And it's like, it's something you can't always explain even. And of course we're rational beings.
Yeah,
and,
mostly.
Yeah, I should revise that, shouldn't I, after listening to your show? you want to make sense of the world, even
Yes.
if it's irrational sense, if that makes sense. You want to make sense of your environment and where you are and where you might be and what you might become.
So you're 15, 16 years old. You're engaged in school, albeit that you've got this nightmare journey and the inability to fully immerse yourself in the social life and the friendships that geography initially demands. What were you good at? Did you have teachers that saw something in you that pointed a way forward, or were you?
I think the English, in English language and writing, I used to get very good marks for my essays, my imaginative essays. And again, people have subsequently said to me, oh, yeah, you wrote that piece which was in the school magazine. I've got all my old school magazines, actually. And, so you wrote that. And so I really, really enjoyed that. Of course, I was going to say, of course, sports. But this even, I would say, it almost predates the stereotype that associates black people with strength and power in sports. And so what happened was, although I was good at tennis, for example, I would be in the tennis team, but in the second team.
Right.
And in hockey, I was a fast runner, but I was put in goal. So it seemed to me that I was positioned, I was seen in a particular way as, even though, kind of good at sports, but not at the top level in any kind of position. So, but I did enjoy every sport apart from swimming. And so conforming to a different stereotype. It was, I had encouragement from my art teacher as well. And I really loved art. I loved all of the arts.
And if I'd met you then and said, what do you want to be when you grow up or when you leave school, what would you have said?
I'm laughing because there was a moment where I actually thought I would become a scientist. And given that I was completely useless at the sciences, that was a real fantasy. But I don't think I had an idea. I might have had ambitions that were so secret even I didn't know them.
Okay.
I certainly wouldn't have dared to articulate them.
That's the carapace again.
Yeah,
perhaps.
exactly.
Exactly. Just burying everything.
I think I said to social workers that I wanted to be a PE teacher.
Okay. Because you thought maybe they would want to hear that? Or
I thought I could get into college.
Right.
And that if I flunked all of my exams, I would get a place at a teacher training college, because in those days, it wasn't, you didn't have to have a degree to teach.
So there's an element of survival involved in that, thinking about that will keep me fed and watered for another 2 or 3, another 3 or 4 years, which again is not something many teenagers have to be conscious of, is it?
No, that's right.
And it is a rug pulling exercise, leaving care. It's an extraordinarily violent experience, and in many ways it still is. I know you work in this field, and Fatima Whitbread, who has sat in that chair in the past, also campaigns passionately to improve this guillotine, I would call it, of concern.
The care cliff is what it's called. Slightly less violent metaphor. But it's the care cliff they refer to it today as. And I absolutely recognise that. And they recognise, by the same token, the young people today recognise, that what I was experiencing. Some elements are different and a little bit better, but in the main, it's anybody who has children or knows children, when they reach the age of 18, how many parents or friends would say, okay, out you go,
you're
now,
all right
off you
now.
go. Yeah, you're all right now, you're all done, you're all grown up, go and find your own place, and all of that. That doesn't, But
in care it's a date. It's a minute. The clock ticks, the second hand ticks from need care to don't need care.
Yeah, exactly.
It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And so, that is one area that really needs to be. There've been some improvements. There's this stay put until you're 25, but that's reliant on having a foster parent that you get on with and agrees with you staying, and you wanting to stay there, and whatever else you're doing, if that's appropriate. If there's lots of younger kids, who knows? But there's not really adequate way of caring for care experienced young people.
And you'd think there'd have been some major improvements since your time, but as you say, they're tinkerings, really, incremental improvements. And you write, it felt like the moment I turned 18, there was somebody from the council saying, you're no longer in care, off you go. It was a very difficult period in my life, coinciding and probably not unlinked to the failure to get the grades you needed to go to university. I like the idea. I think we'll create the idea that you got exactly the same grades as Prince Charles, who
More or less.
who went to Cambridge.
Yeah. And I went off to work for North Thames Gas.
Yes.
Yeah, so, which was great, which was fine at the time.
But it's not
at
what
least
you
I had a job.
wanted. She
It's
did
not
it again there already. You're saying it was great, it was fine at the time. You were gutted at the time, I think.
Yeah, I was gutted with the A-level
Yeah.
results, absolutely. And I mean, it was difficult, again, through no fault of individuals. But how can you study for your A-levels when you've got 6 kids, 10 kids or whatever running around the playroom? So then it becomes, well, okay, we'll empty the playroom for you. And it's like, because of you.
Yeah, they've all got it in for you.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't quite as bad as that, but there was certainly, I sort of felt, I don't want to squeeze them out in order. And anyway, by that time, my studying had really fallen down. I was just there was not enough room in my head to think about studying. And then there was, what if I did get into university? Where was I going to go during the vacations? Who was going to support me if I felt down or wanted to drop out and all of those things? But I had hoped to go to university at 18.
So this is where self-sufficiency is thrust upon you. And that was an unhappy experience or a difficult experience.
It was, again, there were elements of like, well, I can do what I want. I mean, and this really comes to the fore for me when I decide to go, oh, okay, I'm going to study drama. Because there was nobody to say to me, you can't do that. There was no parent saying, that's not the type of occupation we expect for you. Or it'll be a waste of time because you'll never get any acting work. You're a black woman. What are you thinking of? So I just thought, oh, okay, I'll do this and see what happens.
So we've skipped the 2 years at North Thames Gas Board. we fast forwarded through that.
Well, it was kind of, I was going to say it was kind of unremarkable in lots of respects. I had some good friends there, and I did somehow become the office rep and had to kind of argue that women should be able to wear trousers in the office. Can you believe?
No.
Well, that was the case, yes. As long as they were wearing a top which covered their bottoms.
It's unbelievable. Really? Gosh, how the world turns.
Yeah.
This is also the period during which you sort of experimented with not calling yourself Lola. Calling yourself Margaret, because you said you wanted to wash the stench of care off you. So
I think that's, again, in retrospect, I think that must have been what it was about, because I never really liked that name.
New me.
Sorry?
The new me.
I wanted to be a new... So it was, maybe, it must have been conscious to some degree, because obviously that's what I said. I'd known for some years that my first name was actually Margaret. And I thought, yes, Margaret Young. How English is that? Nobody would be able to spot from my application form, what my ethnicity was. But although that wasn't in my head, because we weren't thinking in those terms then, but it was very clearly like trying to stake a claim, I guess.
But it didn't stick.
No, because I thought, I'm not a Margaret. And certainly going to drama college, Lola seemed much more appropriate.
Of course it did. And you did that in 1972. But before that, there was a brief period where you went back to Adams Street, the final home you were in, to work as a residential childcare officer and became Auntie Lola.
Yes. And
why didn't that stick?
Well, I think maybe it was on shaky foundations.
Yes.
Because like you were saying earlier, maybe that was an attempt to try and be loving and caring towards these children. And but I just sort of felt a little bit inadequate. And also maybe it was a little bit of a cop-out in some respect. Well, because that was a safe space, okay?
Yeah.
I knew even the same person that had been sort of responsible for me, Auntie Elizabeth, was still working there. And actually, do you know what? As I'm saying that, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, Auntie Elizabeth was a little old white lady, so it's like sort of the, Mum had gone, Daisy had gone. There I was back with a maybe...
nurture.
Yeah. But also... I don't know, I was ready to spread my wings, let's put it like that, and sort of see more of the world.
And so you go to drama school.
And so I go to drama school.
How successfully did you spread your wings?
Well, really, very successfully in terms of wow, this whole new world. It's where I started to sing.
Right.
I acted, I stage managed, I wrote stuff.
Where did this come from? Because there's not much indication so far in your life that this would be the place to bloom, the place to blossom.
Not at all. And Kyan and I went to amateur dramatics because we like the arts again and performing and what have you. But then I sort of thought, well, this could be really interesting.
Right.
And the college I went to eventually, you got a teaching certificate, so there was the backstop.
Yeah.
If it hadn't worked out, I could have taught English and drama.
And it did work out. Just before we get on to that, a little bit on. I mean, did you feel safe at drama school? Did you feel nurtured there? Because people talk about finding their tribe in life, finding the people with whom you have the most in common. Was there any of that going on here? I didn't think there was.
No, I didn't feel that at all.
I didn't think there was.
No.
Why not?
There was a bit of a class thing going on there.
Okay.
I say a bit, quite a lot.
Right.
I mean, I'd not been in the company of people whom I perceived to have so much privilege.
Because you'd not gone to grammar school.
No, I hadn't gone to grammar school. I certainly hadn't gone to a fee-paying private school
and so
like
now
many of these people had.
Now you're mixing with people whose background was like mine.
Yeah, and I'm mixing with people and I'm thinking, and this is before the recent trend for ripped jeans and everything,
Yes.
I'm thinking, why do they dress so scruffily when they've got money? You know, what is that about? I'd die to have the money to spend on clothes.
Gosh, yes. But you have a gift, you have a talent. The acting goes quite well.
Kind of.
You come out.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, one of the things I would look back and say, right time, right place. Okay, so there's a moment where the consciousness about the lack of representation is just beginning to emerge. So it's like, I think I referred to one of our drama teachers who had this idea that she wanted a black Desdemona and a white Othello.
Oh, revolution,
iconoclast. Wow, let's go for it. And people said, oh yeah, that's why you got in, because we can only have one black person a year. That was the joke, but was actually kind of true. And so there was no sort of sense of finding a group of people with whom I wanted to develop the kind of friendships that I had at school.
And you've sustained those friendships, I think.
Parliament Hill School.
That's special.
Yes. The Parlettes.
They're your crew.
Yeah, they're my crew. Absolutely. And throughout the book, I actually use their real names because I hope it's fine. I didn't check with them first, but I hope it should be fine.
Can I ask you a weird question?
Yeah, you can ask, but I won't guarantee that I'll answer it.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
When was the first time someone told you that they loved you?
Oof. Right. Well, I would have to say it was my husband. Although it was before he became my husband,
of course.
But that I can remember.
And
I think so. When again, we come back to this thing about love. Okay, so when we were talking earlier about what is love. And I'm slightly deflecting here whilst I gather my thoughts. But there was, some of the things I found in my records were things that I'd written to social workers, and I signed off "Love from Lola."
Yeah.
And what did that mean? Dear Mrs. So-and-so, love from Lola. You're my social worker. So this idea of love and what it is has always been something that's a shifting thing. So when a friend says they love you, friends don't, they'll say, oh, I love you.
Yeah.
Even like that, even that doesn't sound kind of right, really. So, so it's in particular situations where somebody will say they love you.
But the first time it was said with heft.
Yes. Was then, yes.
With your former husband, to whom you're still close and with whom you have a son.
Yes.
Who no doubt tells you that he loves you all the time.
Yes.
Why is that difficult for you?
I think there's still a residual. Why would they like me?
Yeah.
Let alone love me. Why would somebody and it sounds sort of self-pitying, but it's not meant to be. It doesn't feel like that. It's just is really seeking a rational explanation for something that is kind of mad, isn't it? It's not It's not a fruitful enterprise to be able to say, I wonder, could you just write down a list of the things?
But it goes right back as well, because even at school you'd think, why do they want to be my friend?
Yeah, I sort of think, oh, this is nice. The in-group want me to be in their group. So I sort of think, why might that be?
You deserve to be loved.
Yes, well, you see, interesting. I was interviewed by Mandy Lita. I don't know if you know her, and she talked about this mattering. Everybody deserves to matter, and I think it's such an interesting way of putting it. So if you really matter to somebody, I guess love almost immediately follows on from that, because it would mean that without your presence, something would be missing from their life. You're beaming in a kind of...
It's a beautiful way of thinking.
Well, yeah, I wish I could say it was my sort of original thought, but it certainly was stimulated by Mandy's words, yeah.
It also made me think, looking at because we're nearing the end of our time together, but looking at what happened subsequently in your life, that there was a subconscious need to matter. Yeah, definitely. To the world. Yes, I think so. And I mean, a lot of people will talk about, they want their life to mean something. But it's not the kind of, look at me, no. I'm really needy, please look at me and acknowledge me. But it's more like, look, I need to feel for myself that I've been useful. Yeah. And that's not to say I can't be, frivolous and fun, I think, and all of those things too. But I think having a sense of purpose, and it's really interesting because a lot of people I know do have a very strong sense of purpose, and I can really relate to that and work with that and with them. And it produces actually some wonderful synergies professionally, not least in the people that come to me and email me and say, have you got space for an intern or a work experience or what have you? And honestly, James, I can honestly say it's like having those people, particularly because they're young as well, so they can teach me about the current world, contemporary world. But having said, I want to do this and I want to change that. That's fantastic to me. And there's no way I'm going to say, well, it takes a lot of time and you have to do this and you have to do that. It's important. So that explains that next bit of the journey, doesn't it? Is that your acting career was successful. You were even in Metal Mickey, which was one of my
Did you watch that?
I used to watch Metal Mickey while eating a Finder's crispy pancake. That was the deal. That was one of my favourite programmes, and that was my favourite tea. Yes.
How old were you? Can I ask?
I can't remember really, but it'd be 8, 9 or something like that probably.
Now you made me feel really old.
Right, you presented Play School as well. There was lots of rep, but ultimately it didn't matter enough. Yeah. So you go into arts management, you're trying to change young people's lives, and it then culminates in your political career, and you're becoming a people's peer. Having been head of culture at the Greater London Authority, you then seek to become a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, which isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of another one. Yeah, exactly. There are all of these sort of multiple threads that carry on. So alongside that, or interwoven with that, is my identity as a care experience person. Yes, which runs through everything, doesn't it?
And it does.
There's bits in the book that we haven't really touched upon, like the return to Nigeria, but we want to give people reasons to buy it, don't we? We want to give people reasons to find out more. But you do achieve the almost initially impossible seeming task of knitting everything together.
Yeah, and I think that's what gives me a degree of satisfaction, I think, when I look back. And I think it may not make sense to other people, but I can see where these threads are interwoven. And how it's about not leaving aspects of myself behind, which helps me, I hope, to be quite empathetic and also to be imaginative. So that I find helpful when I'm working with people.
So I don't think it was maybe the third loudest laugh that I've heard from you today came when I asked you what your ambitions were as a child, if I'd met you at school. So you've never really had formal ambition in the sense that a lot of us do, even if it was something as silly as look at me, look at me, look at me. You've not had boxes that you wanted to tick.
Not then.
No.
Not then. As I got older, I did.
Yes.
Certainly, I even wrote them down.
So what is left? What ambitions do you have now?
It's probably too many to fit into.
Well, give me the biggest. Give me a favourite.
The biggest one would be to write, direct, maybe produce a film.
Wow. Well, I wouldn't bet against it.
Oh, great. I'll hold you to that.
8 Weeks by Baroness Lola Young. You don't put the Baroness on the
No,
cover.
I didn't want that on the cover. It's not necessary.
By Lola Young is out now. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.